Hi, I'm Karen Sherry, the Curator of Museum Collections at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. And I'm here today to present one of our newest exhibitions, which is called Agents of Change, Female Activism in Virginia from Women's Suffrage to Today. And this is an exhibition that commemorates a milestone anniversary, the centennial of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. And the 19th Amendment is the one that guaranteed women the right to vote. It was ratified in 1920 and constitutes the single largest expansion of the electorate in US history. So by guaranteeing all American women the right to vote, it pretty much doubled the number of eligible voters in the US. And in addition to being the culmination of over 7 decades of activism for gaining the right to vote for women, for gaining female suffrage, the fight to pass the 19th Amendment also fundamentally shifted not just American politics, but also American society. And this exhibition looks at that history, both the fight for female suffrage as well as its long legacy over a century of female activism in the Commonwealth. So as we go through this exhibition, we're going to encounter a selection of female change makers from different time periods, from different parts of the Commonwealth, women representing different causes and strategies of activism. We're going to focus on a few of these figures to see the myriad ways in which women have changed their communities, the Commonwealth, and our country for the better. The Agents of Change exhibition is one of many activities around the Commonwealth commemorating the centennial of the 19th Amendment and women's suffrage. It is sponsored by the Commonwealth of Virginia's Women's Suffrage Centennial Commemoration, which is made up of a task force of bipartisan legislatures and civilian members. The commemoration is organized by the Virginia Museum of History and Culture in partnership with the Library of Virginia. These two institutions, as well as institutions around the Commonwealth, are hosting a range of events and programs to celebrate the impact of women's suffrage. The Agents of Change exhibition, which is on view here at the museum, is traveling to venues around the state through the commemoration. There are also educational initiatives and various other programs. So if you're interested in learning about more activities, please visit our website at virginiahistory.org to learn more about the commemoration activities. Some of the female change makers that you'll encounter in the Agents of Change exhibition include Adele Clark and Nora Houston. These women were partners in life and also partners in activism. They were both artists who became very engaged in the women's suffrage movement. And here in Virginia, that movement really got started in a concerted way in 1909, when these two women, as well as a larger group of about 20 Richmond women, most of whom were from the middle and upper middle classes, they got together in 1909 and formed the Equal Suffrage League of Virginia, or ESL. And this organization would become the largest suffrage organization in the Commonwealth and one of the largest, in fact, in the South. It began in Richmond, but over the years, the organization swelled and founded chapters across the Commonwealth. So pretty much every city and town across the Commonwealth had an ESL chapter during the period. And this foundation of the Equal Suffrage League reflects the larger efforts nationally, the concerted fight that really got going around 1900 as American women increasingly called to have the right to vote. And that call for suffrage really bucked up against conventional notions about not only American society, but particularly American womanhood. Conventional notions that believed that the public sphere, politics and civic life, were a rough and tumble business and therefore suited only to men, whereas women were, according to these traditional conceptions, suited for domestic life and the home. Well, over the course of time, American women wanted to be able to change their communities for the better. In the progressive era of the early 20th century, many women were getting involved in clubs and organizations trying to improve their communities by recognizing the problems caused by poverty, by poor education, by poor labor laws, which really exploited workers. And these women came to realize that they didn't really have the power to effect change in their communities because they lacked the vote, that fundamental aspect of a democracy that suggests that government is by the people and for the people. Well, in America, without Virginia women and other American women having that right, they really had no voice in saying how the society was run and what laws and other civic regulations were passed. So that's what really motivated the development of the suffrage movement in the early decades of the 20th century. And as I mentioned, Adele Clark and Nora Houston, they were active champions, really tireless campaigners for the right to vote here in Virginia. They traveled around the Commonwealth giving speeches. They helped organize chapters. They wrote and produced literature. They used their artistic skills as professional artists to design materials for the suffrage fight and so forth. And interestingly, they used their status as artists to draw attention to the suffrage cause. Later in life, Adele Clark recalled how when she was campaigning for suffrage, she used to go out into Richmond's parks and streets, and she would set up her easel and start to draw or sketch or paint something. And passers-by would be curious about what she was doing, so they would come up to talk to her. And then once she had their attention, she would launch into her spiel about women's suffrage. So these women and other suffrage activists use various methods to advance their cause. And you'll see some artifacts related to the activities of the Equal Suffrage League in this exhibition, including something like this Votes for Women flag. It's a flag that is golden in color. Gold, purple, and white were the traditional colors of the American suffrage movement. And these kinds of banners were waved at rallies and distributed to supporters. And it also reminds us that as part of the suffragists' challenge of traditional notions of American womanhood, these women were appearing in public, talking on street corners, giving speeches and so forth. That was a very radical act in Virginia in the early 20th century. The Virginia public was not accustomed to seeing women take such an assertive and proactive role in public life on the city and in the public spaces across the Commonwealth. Now, in Virginia, the ESL for the first few years of the organization was focused on gaining voting rights at the state level. They were focused on changing the state constitution of Virginia to grant women the right to vote. So they focused on lobbying Virginia's General Assemblymen and trying to pressure them to pass a state amendment. Over the course of the 19-teens, it became evident that that wasn't going to happen. And so the ESL turned its attention to lobbying to pass a federal amendment, the 19th Amendment. And that kind of difference between working for female suffrage at the state level versus at the national level is an issue that divided suffragists across the nation. We see the ESL kind of changing its tactics, changing its position over the course of the 19-teens. In 1919, the Virginia General Assembly voted down the 19th Amendment. That was after the US Congress passed the 19th Amendment and sent it to the states for ratification. Virginia was one of those states that voted no. But ultimately, enough states ratified the 19th Amendment to make it the law of the land. Now, you might think, well, Virginia never ratified the 19th Amendment when it had the opportunity at that point. So you might think that the ESL was a failure. The fight for female suffrage was a failure in Virginia. And while it's true they didn't get the General Assembly on board, the activities of the ESL, the organizational structures that they developed, their networks, their tactics, fundamentally changed the nature of politics, not just in the Commonwealth, but we see this happening across the country. Politicians realized that they had to answer to these women because these women were going to their offices, starting letter writing campaigns, lobbying them, and so forth. This was a new and a very large political bloc that politicians had to be responsive to. So in that way, female suffragists really had a major impact on political discourse and political life here in Virginia. Now, it's also important to note that the women's suffrage movement here in Virginia and across the nation was unfortunately marked by racism. The Equal Suffrage League of Virginia did not admit Black women, and that's one of the ways in which the movement was, as I say, really marked by deep-seated racism. And race became a dominant issue in the debates around suffrage. While the ESL and other pro-suffrage organizations were arguing for suffrage, there were anti-suffrage forces at work as well. And race was often a topic of debate between those two sides, with the anti-suffrage forces really using race as a scare tactic in the South by claiming that if you gave women the right to vote, you would empower enough Black women with the vote that you would create what they called Negro domination, which they perceived as a threat to white control and white supremacy in Virginia and other Southern states. So there is this pernicious seed of racism that marks the suffrage movement. As I say, the ESL, it never admitted Black women, and it also published broadsides, such as the one you see in this exhibition, when it tries to assuage white people's fears about empowering Black women with the vote by listing the various ways that women's suffrage will not jeopardize white supremacy in the state. So that's one of the more problematic aspects of female suffrage that we need to consider when we're looking at this history. The Agents of Change exhibition features the activities of two very important Black female activists from the first half of the 20th century. Maggie Walker, who was a giant, not just in the Black communities of Richmond, but also nationally. She's known as someone who worked tirelessly to improve the conditions of Black communities in Richmond and beyond. And this was during an age of Jim Crow segregation and racial discrimination, when Black communities were underserved by various municipal services and so forth. So Maggie Walker is renowned for being the first Black female bank president in the US. She founded a bank to serve Black communities at a time when white-owned banks would not serve Black customers. She founded a newspaper, a department store, benefit organizations that provided insurance and death benefits and other services to the Black community. Another one of these Black activists you'll encounter in Agents of Change is Dr. Zenobia Gilpin. She was also active in Richmond as one of the city's first Black female doctors. And in that position, she had to face both sexism and racism in a profession that generally was reluctant to open up to women and also to Black doctors. Dr. Gilpin had to get her medical training out of state. She went to Howard University in Washington, D.C., because Virginia's medical schools and other graduate programs were segregated at that time, and they did not admit Black students. Once she received her medical degree in 1923, she devoted her career to serving Black communities and to providing medical services, again, at a time when many hospitals would not admit Black patients, when Black Americans had limited access to medical care. So Dr. Gilpin became one of their great champions here in Richmond, but she also served in a national capacity as well. And she pioneered a model of community health care that was adopted by communities across the nation. She set up health clinics in Black churches and other local organizations to provide medical education and medical services to these Black communities that were largely underserved by white society. And that model of community health care brought her not only national attention, but was copied in communities around the nation. And in the exhibition, you'll see some artifacts related to her professional life, including a notebook in which she kept her notes about various medical ailments and their treatments. So this is a really fascinating notebook filled with her handwriting that talks about diseases she encounters and what the treatments are for those various ailments. There's also a microscope that she used in her medical practice. And even though she herself specialized in women's health, in gynecology and obstetrics, she really provided general medical services for many Black patients here in Virginia and farther afield. Laura Lou Copenhaver was a multi-talented woman who devoted her life to the educational, spiritual, and economic uplift of her community in Southwest Virginia. She lived in Marion, Virginia. And one of the aspects of her career that's featured in the Agents of Change exhibition is her efforts to help the impoverished communities of Southwest Virginia. And she did that by establishing a craft collective that was called Rosemont Industries. This was established in 1916, and it was a collective that hired, on a contract basis, local women artisans to create hooked rugs, to weave blankets, and create other household items. This collective also purchased their raw materials like sheep's wool from local farmers. So it was a collective that very much benefited a region of the state that was generally very impoverished and was not always served by state resources. And Laura Lou Copenhaver recognized that need and established what became a very successful company and business model that lasted into the 21st century. These women made these various items, and here's an example of one of the best-selling items of Rosemont Industries. These items were sold across the nation and indeed around the world through a catalog, mail order catalog, and there's some examples of the catalog in the exhibition. But this particular coverlet, it's called the Lover's Knot pattern, and this was one of the best sellers of the Rosemont Industries. And if you look closely at the pattern, you will see along the border there are pine trees, kind of stylized pine trees that are meant to evoke the landscapes of Southwest Virginia and the Shenandoah Mountains. You'll also see forms that represent knots, giving the name of this pattern Lover's Knots. So by running this company, Laura Lou Copenhaver provided much needed economic opportunities for women and their families to have some financial self-sufficiency, which became particularly valuable during the Great Depression when so many families across the Commonwealth and across America were struggling to get by. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s resulted in some milestone legislation which really fundamentally changed our definitions of equality in America. Various moments during the civil rights movement overturned decades-old practices of legalized segregation by race. It required equality under the law, regardless of one's racial or ethnic identities. It guaranteed voting rights and so forth. Women's role in the civil rights movement is often overlooked in the face of some of the more well-known male heroes like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and others. Nevertheless, women played a vital, if often overlooked, role in the civil rights movement. And one Virginia activist who played such a role is Evelyn Butts, who was a seamstress from Norfolk who very early on in her life got involved in civil rights activism. She marched and campaigned to desegregate Norfolk schools. She fought for various rights for Norfolk's Black citizens. She also became a plaintiff in a landmark civil rights case that ultimately barred the poll tax as a measure to suppress the vote. And the poll tax is something that had been instituted in Virginia in its 1902 state constitution. And it was the single most effective way that the white establishment disenfranchised Black voters. First, Black male voters who were able to vote in the early 20th century. Black women could not vote until the 19th Amendment of 1920. But the poll tax was a significant hurdle, not just for Black Americans, but for many poorer white Americans as well. This poll tax as an obstacle to voting became the target of civil rights activism. And as I say, Evelyn Butts became a plaintiff. She filed a lawsuit to strike down that poll tax, which was prohibitively expensive for so many Black and poor white families across the Commonwealth. And ultimately, her case, Harper v. Board of Virginia, which was decided by the US Supreme Court in 1966, banned the poll tax. Now, even though Evelyn Butts, as a seamstress who supported a family and her husband who was a disabled veteran, even though she found the poll tax to be a struggle, she was absolutely insistent upon exercising her right to vote. And she always managed to scrape together enough money to pay the poll tax. And one of the items you'll see in this exhibition is a copy from Virginia's state poll tax records, which lists all the people who paid their poll tax. That register is segregated by white and Black voters. So Evelyn Butts appears in the section listing Black voters who paid their poll tax. She always paid it so that she could vote, but she also fought heroically to overturn the poll tax and get rid of one of the chief obstacles to the ballot that Black men and women and poorer people across Virginia faced. The 1960s and 70s saw an upsurge of female activism in the United States, what's often called second wave feminist movement, with the first wave being the fight for women's suffrage in the early decades of the 20th century. In the 60s and 70s, American women were fighting against the deeply ingrained sexism in American society, and they were also fighting against their second-class citizen. They were fighting for various rights and access to job equality, pay equity, educational opportunities, and a range of other rights. And a major champion for women's rights here in Virginia was Flora Curator, who was active in Northern Virginia. Flora Curator founded the first chapter of the National Organization for Women here in Virginia. She was also a tireless advocate for a range of causes related not just to women's issues, but to issues of social justice and equality across the board. She is particularly renowned for being one of the most influential forces in getting the US Congress to pass the Equal Rights Amendment in 1972. Flora Curator led a group of women activists who visited the halls of US Congress every week and met with senators and congressmen and lobbied to get them to pass the Equal Rights Amendment, which had first been introduced in 1924, but had languished and not been taken up in a concerted way by Congress until the efforts of Flora Curator and her group of women who earned the nickname the Curator's Raiders. And there's a certificate here in the exhibition that was given to Flora Curator by her colleagues that's signed by various members of the Curator's Raiders. And it was really their indefatigable efforts that got the ERA passed in both houses, the House and Senate, of the US Congress, and then sent to the states for ratification. Now, as various state legislatures were considering the ERA in the 1970s and into the 1980s, Curator continued championing for the passage or the ratification of the ERA, but we also see the rise of an anti-ERA movement. So very much like women's suffrage, there were activists on both sides of that cause. The ERA has recently gained new interest because in January 2020, Virginia became the final state needed to ratify the ERA when the General Assembly finally passed the ERA after several earlier efforts in which the General Assembly voted it down. The 2020 General Assembly approved it, making Virginia the final state needed to ratify the ERA. Now, the fate of the ERA at the time of this recording remains uncertain because there are questions about whether the ratification is valid after a deadline that was set by the US Congress. So I think various politicians and legal experts and the laws are going to be debating this for a little while, but at least there's the possibility that Virginia, through the efforts of Flora Curator and her continuing legacy, will be the 38th and final state required to pass an amendment that guarantees equality for US citizens regardless of sex. And that could have a major impact on things like pay equity and other aspects of American society. The Agents of Change exhibition explores female activism across the past century, from the fight for women's suffrage, which culminated in 1920, to the present day. But it's important to remind ourselves that there have been women active in Virginia trying to improve their communities for a much, much longer time. And that's particularly the case for Virginia's native peoples. And we have a representative of that facet of Virginia's history in the figure of Chief Ann Richardson, who in 1998 became the chief of the Rappahannock tribe, making her the first woman to lead a Virginia Indian tribe since the 18th century. Even before becoming chief, Chief Ann Richardson was engaged in working for Indian rights and to improve the lot of her tribal community. She was instrumental in helping the Rappahannock peoples obtain first state recognition and then more recently federal recognition, which finally came in 2018. She's also been an active champion of the preservation of tribal cultures in the form of language, dance, craft, and other traditional practices. She's established programs to pass on that tribal knowledge to new generations so that can be preserved. And that's all while fighting centuries of discrimination, disenfranchisement, and dispossession for Native peoples. And one of the really extraordinary objects that you'll see in the Agents of Change exhibition that reflects Chief Anne's tribal identity and also her commitment to preserving tribal culture is this beautiful buckskin beaded dress that she wore when she was a young woman and very active in performing tribal dances. The Agents of Change exhibition brings us up to the present moment and a present period in which we're seeing a resurgence of female activism. The past few years has witnessed the development of annual women's marches, which began in 2017 and witnessed marches across the globe, one of the largest of which was in Washington, D.C., and an iconic image that represents that resurgence of female activism as women are fighting against deeply entrenched patterns of gender-based disparity and fighting for other issues. One of the iconic symbols of that resurgence of female activism is the pussy hat that was first developed and worn by many participants in the women's marches beginning in 2017. This new activism has seen record numbers of women obtaining elected office out of a recognition that women's concerns were not getting due attention from our legislative bodies, which still tend to be dominated by men. So here in Virginia and states across the nation, we've seen record numbers of women running for and winning elected office. In addition, in Virginia, we've seen the first ever female Speaker of the House of Delegates and the first ever female and African-American President pro tem of our state Senate. So we're seeing women start to have a greater voice in our political bodies and effect the kind of legislation that comes out of them. We also see in contemporary activism a recognition of the intersection of various issues that determine the nature of equality and equity in our American society. So we see many activists focusing not just on one particular cause, but on the intersection of how race and gender and class and other issues might impact somebody's ability to enjoy the benefits and true equity in American society. And we're certainly seeing a resurgence of activism around racial justice issues in 2020 following the death of George Floyd at the hands of police and the series of reckonings that event has kicked off as we as a nation reckon with not only our long legacy of racism, but other disparities across American society. And the pandemic caused by the coronavirus has also shed light on many of those disparities in terms of access to healthcare, in pay, in racial justice, and so forth. So I think these recent events, even though they're still happening and it's hard to have a historical perspective on them yet, we can appreciate that many activists today are building on the legacy of a century of female activists and their advocates, techniques and networks and strategies that were developed by the female suffragists in the early decades of the 20th century are still bearing fruit today. Of course, the technology has changed, but oftentimes some of the strategies and the overarching impetus to improve our communities, to push our nation to become an ever more perfect union is still motivating activists today. So I hope you've enjoyed this tour of the Agents of Change exhibition. You can learn more about the exhibition through the Virginia Museum of History and Culture's website at virginiahistory.org. Thank you.